Nobody was supposed to die on that Indiana highway that morning, but by sunset, 4 lives were gone, 1 man was in federal custody, and a question began spreading across America that no one could answer yet. How did a routine drive turn into a national story that would expose failures no one wanted to admit? At 6:12 a.m., Interstate 70 looked like any other weekday artery cutting through Indiana. Tractor trailers hummed along in the slow lane. Commuters sipped coffee, half awake, trusting that the road would behave the way it always did. The sky was pale gray, not stormy, not dangerous, just ordinary. And ordinary is what makes disasters invisible until it's too late. The semi-truck entered the frame like a shadow that didn't belong there. It was a long-haul rig, white cab, faded company logo, hauling close to 80,000 pounds. The driver's name, according to the paperwork later recovered, was Miguel Alvarez. 37 years old. No criminal record. No traffic violations serious enough to raise alarms. On paper, he was invisible. In reality, he was about to become the center of a national argument. Witnesses would later say the truck drifted first. Not a swerve, not a panic move, just a slow, deliberate slide across lanes, as if the driver's hands had loosened their grip. One sedan honked. Another tried to brake. There was no time. Metal screamed. The first impact crushed a compact car carrying a young couple on their way to work. The second collision involved a pickup truck with 2 construction workers inside. The third impact was the semi itself slamming into the concrete median, finally stopping the chain reaction it had started. By 6:14 a.m., traffic was frozen. By 6:16 a.m., the first 911 calls flooded in. By 6:20 a.m., first responders realized this wasn't just an accident. It was a mass fatality scene. 4 people were pronounced dead before ambulances could even leave the highway. Miguel Alvarez survived. When state police reached the cab, they expected chaos, panic, screaming. Instead, they found silence. Miguel sat slumped forward, hands resting on the wheel, eyes open but unfocused. He wasn't injured badly. No blood. No obvious trauma. Just shock, maybe exhaustion, maybe something else entirely. "Sir, can you hear me?" An officer asked. Miguel nodded. "Do you know what happened?" Miguel didn't answer. That silence would echo across the country. Within hours, news helicopters hovered above the wreckage. Traffic cameras replayed the collision on loop. Social media filled the gaps with speculation. Drunk driving, mechanical failure, medical emergency, terrorism. Every theory raced ahead of the facts. Then came the detail that changed everything. Miguel Alvarez was taken into custody not just by state police, but by federal agents. Immigration and Customs Enforcement arrived before noon. That single fact ignited a firestorm. By evening, headlines across the nation screamed variations of the same sentence: migrant truck driver in ICE custody after deadly Indiana crash. Cable news panels lit up. Politicians tweeted. Commentators argued. And the families of the victims sat in living rooms that suddenly felt too quiet, watching strangers turn their loved ones into talking points. But the truth was more complicated than any headline could handle. Miguel Alvarez had entered the United States legally years earlier. His work authorization paperwork was valid at the time of the crash. But his commercial driving certification had a problem. Not an obvious one. A quiet one. A bureaucratic delay that no system flagged until it was far too late. And there was something else. Investigators reviewing dashcam footage noticed Miguel's truck had been drifting long before the crash. Minutes earlier. Miles earlier. Not erratic. Not aggressive. Just wrong. They pulled his logbooks. Perfect. Too perfect. No missed breaks. No excessive hours. Everything clean. That made the silence in the cab more disturbing. At the county jail, Miguel finally spoke. "I didn't fall asleep," he said softly. "I didn't drink. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." The officer asked the obvious question. "Then what happened?" Miguel hesitated. Then he said something no one expected. "I blacked out, but I was awake." Doctors would later struggle to explain what that meant. As investigators dug deeper, they discovered Miguel had complained of headaches weeks earlier. Blurry vision. Moments where the road felt unreal. He had visited a clinic, but without insurance, without time, without the ability to stop working, nothing had followed. Because in America's freight system, stopping means disappearing. By nightfall, ICE confirmed Miguel was in their custody pending investigation. Prosecutors announced potential charges. Advocacy groups mobilized. Commentators hardened their positions. But one fact remained unchanged. 4 families would never hear their loved ones' voices again. And the man everyone wanted to turn into a symbol sat alone in a holding cell, staring at the wall, replaying a morning that would never reset. What no one knew yet was that this crash was only the beginning. Because as federal investigators traced Miguel's route backward, as medical specialists reviewed his symptoms, and as journalists uncovered how many drivers like him were quietly slipping through regulatory cracks, a much larger truth began to surface. This wasn't just about one driver. It was about a system designed to move faster than accountability. And in the coming days, that system would start to break open. What investigators were about to uncover would force America to confront questions it had been avoiding for years. And it would lead to a revelation no one on that highway could have imagined that morning. The story was only beginning. By the next morning, the crash was no longer just a tragedy. It was a battlefield. Outside the county jail, television bands lined the street like armored vehicles. Reporters rehearsed their stand-ups, adjusting ties, smoothing jackets, waiting for updates that might tilt the narrative one way or another. Protesters gathered on opposite sides of the road, holding signs that reduced a complex human disaster into slogans simple enough to chant. Inside, Miguel Alvarez sat in a narrow interview room, his wrists uncuffed now, a paper cup of water untouched on the table in front of him. He had not slept. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the weight again, heard the sound again, the moment where everything slipped out of his control. A federal investigator named Thomas Reed entered the room carrying a thin folder. Reed wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive. He had learned long ago that silence often made people talk more than pressure ever could. Miguel, Reed said, taking a seat. We're not here to argue politics. We're here to understand what happened on that road. Miguel nodded slowly. Reed slid a photograph across the table. It was a still image from a traffic camera, taken nearly 9 miles before the crash. Miguel's truck could be seen drifting toward the shoulder. Do you remember this moment? Reed asked. Miguel stared at the image longer than necessary. No, he said. I remember driving. I remember the road. But I don't remember that. Reed leaned back. That wasn't the only time. You drifted at least 4 times before the collision. No braking. No correction. Miguel swallowed. I was awake, he said again, as if repeating it might make someone finally understand. But it felt like I wasn't. There. Doctors were already reviewing Miguel's medical history, thin as it was. No primary physician. No long-term records. Just a clinic visit 3 weeks earlier where he'd reported headaches and visual disturbances. The notes were vague. The follow-up non-existent. The truth was brutal and simple. The system wasn't built to catch quiet warnings. Meanwhile, the families of the victims were being ushered into private rooms at the hospital, then later into funeral homes, then finally into a media spotlight none of them had asked for. One family refused all interviews. Another gave a single statement, their voices shaking, pleading for facts over fury. But facts move slowly. Outrage doesn't. Within 24 hours, the crash had become a national talking point. Politicians demanded answers on commercial driver screening. Advocacy groups pointed fingers at immigration enforcement. Trucking industry representatives defended compliance standards. Everyone spoke with certainty. Almost no one spoke with humility. Then came the leak. A local journalist published a short article citing sources close to the investigation, claiming Miguel's commercial license had been processed through an out-of-state certification mill. The term exploded online. Certification mill. Fraud. Shortcut. The reality, again, was more complicated. Miguel had obtained his commercial license legally, but through a third-party training provider operating at the edge of regulation. The paperwork checked out. The training hours were logged. But the depth of medical screening was minimal. No neurological exams. No imaging. Just basic vision tests and self-reported health questions. Questions Miguel had answered honestly. Do you experience headaches? Yes, occasionally. Do you experience dizziness? Sometimes. Are you fit to drive? He checked yes, because he had no choice. Because rent doesn't pause for symptoms. Because freight doesn't wait for uncertainty. As Reed dug deeper, he noticed something else. Miguel's driving logs showed consistent overnight routes, tight delivery windows, little margin for rest beyond what the law strictly required. Legal, but relentless. And the body keeps score. By day 3, prosecutors announced potential charges pending further investigation. The phrase, vehicular manslaughter, appeared in headlines. Miguel's name trended nationwide. His photograph, taken years earlier for a work ID, became the face attached to arguments he never consented to represent. ICE officials confirmed Miguel remained in custody due to an administrative hold. That detail poured gasoline on an already raging fire. What few people noticed was the quiet arrival of another agency. The National Transportation Safety Board had dispatched a team. That changed everything. The NTSB doesn't chase blame. It hunts patterns. Their investigators examined the truck's engine control module, braking system, steering response. Everything worked. No mechanical failure. No tire blowout. No sudden obstruction. They reviewed toxicology. Clean. They reviewed sleep data inferred from logs and biometric indicators. Inconclusive, but no evidence of intoxication or deliberate negligence. Then they brought in neurologists. One specialist, Drive, Elaine Porter, reviewed Miguel's reported symptoms and the behavior visible on video. She paused the footage repeatedly, watching the slow drift, the lack of panic response, the absence of corrective instinct. This doesn't look like sleep, she said quietly. This looks like a transient neurological event. The words landed like a dropped glass. A transient neurological event could mean many things. A seizure without convulsions. A microstroke. A dissociative episode triggered by stress or fatigue. Something invisible. Until it wasn't. If confirmed, it wouldn't erase the deaths. But it would change the story in ways no headline was prepared to handle. As days passed, the initial fury began to fracture. Some commentators softened their tone. Others doubled down. The crash footage continued to circulate, stripped of context, replayed for clicks. Miguel remained in custody, now aware that his fate had drifted far beyond his control. He asked once if he could write letters to the families. The request was denied, at least for now. Outside, another truth was emerging. Federal data showed a rise in commercial drivers reporting neurological symptoms, stress-related blackouts, and dissociative episodes, particularly among long-haul operators under financial pressure. Few stopped driving. Fewer reported issues formally. The system rewarded endurance, not caution. And as investigators began connecting dots between regulation gaps, medical screening failures, and economic pressure, a realization formed that unsettled everyone involved. If Miguel Alvarez could pass every required check and still lose control without warning, then the highway was full of people just like him. Driving. Right now. Part 2 didn't end with answers. It ended with a deeper fear. Because the question was no longer what Miguel did wrong. It was how many times this had almost happened before. And how long it would be before it happened again. The shift happened quietly, the way most uncomfortable truths do. It didn't begin with a press conference or a headline. It began in a windowless federal office where a team of analysts laid photographs, data logs, and medical summaries across a long table and realized they were no longer looking at an isolated crash. They were staring at a pattern. The National Transportation Safety Board expanded its scope. Instead of focusing only on Miguel Alvarez, investigators pulled records from similar incidents across the country. Near misses, unexplained lane departures, single vehicle crashes with no mechanical cause. Drivers who survived and swore the same thing afterward. I was awake, but I wasn't there. The phrase appeared again and again. Dr. Elaine Porter convened a panel of neurologists and occupational health experts. Together, they mapped stress exposure, sleep disruption, diet, economic pressure, and medical neglect. What emerged wasn't a disease you could point to. It was a condition created by circumstances. Long hours, financial desperation, minimal healthcare access, fear of reporting symptoms, a system that treated drivers as components instead of human beings. Miguel fit the profile too well. Meanwhile, the legal case tightened around him. Prosecutors faced a dilemma they didn't want to admit publicly. If Miguel was criminally negligent, the case was straightforward. If he experienced a documented neurological event, responsibility became murky. Not just for him, but for every entity that had signed off on his ability to drive. The trucking company issued a carefully worded statement expressing sympathy while confirming full regulatory compliance. Their lawyers worked overtime. Compliance, after all, was their shield. Miguel's public defender, Sarah Kim, understood what was at stake. This wasn't just about keeping one man out of prison. This was about preventing a verdict that would quietly absolve a system that failed everyone involved. She requested a full independent neurological evaluation. The request was granted. At a federal medical center, Miguel underwent tests he had never even heard of before. EEGs, MRI scans, cognitive response assessments, stress-induced reaction evaluations. For the first time, someone was asking his body questions it had been trying to answer on its own. The results weren't dramatic. No tumor, no obvious damage, but subtle abnormalities appeared in how Miguel's brain responded to prolonged stress and sensory overload. Dr. Porter reviewed the findings. This doesn't incapacitate him permanently, she said. But under the wrong conditions, it can cause dissociation. A person remains conscious but loses situational control. In simpler terms, Miguel had been driving, but his brain had temporarily stopped driving with him. The courtroom, however, had little patience for nuance. At the first hearing, the gallery was packed. Families of the victims sat together, not speaking, united by grief even as the case unfolded around them. Cameras were banned, but reporters filled every available seat outside. The judge listened as prosecutors described the crash in clinical detail. Speed, impact, fatal outcomes. They didn't mention neurological terms. They didn't need to. The weight of the loss spoke for itself. Then Sarah Kim stood. She didn't argue innocence. She argued reality. She described a man who passed every legal requirement placed before him. A man who reported symptoms but lacked access to care. A system that equated legal compliance with safety, even when warning signs were quietly flashing. This is not about excusing harm, she said. This is about understanding responsibility. Outside the courthouse, public opinion fractured further. Some saw Miguel as a victim of exploitation. Others saw him as a danger who never should have been on the road. The middle ground, the one that required patience and complexity, struggled to survive. Then another shoe dropped. An internal memo from a federal agency was leaked to the press. It acknowledged that current commercial driver medical screenings were insufficient to detect certain neurological risks associated with chronic occupational stress. The memo wasn't meant for public consumption. But once it was out, it couldn't be put back. Headlines shifted. Not completely, not cleanly, but enough to change the tone. The question transformed. Not who is to blame, but who is responsible. For Miguel, the days blurred together. He thought about the families constantly. About faces he never saw clearly. About names he didn't yet know. He asked again to write letters. This time, Sarah Kim said she would try. As investigators continued their work, another discovery surfaced. Miguel's route that day had been adjusted last minute to meet a delivery deadline. A longer stretch. Fewer rest opportunities. Just within legal limits. Legal. That word haunted the investigation. Because legal had become a boundary people hid behind instead of a standard to exceed. The NTSB prepared a preliminary report. It stopped short of conclusions, but its implications were clear. Without changes to medical screening, work scheduling, and reporting protections, similar incidents were likely. Not possible. Likely. That word sent ripples through the industry. Quietly, trucking companies began reviewing their own records. Some found things they didn't like. Others chose not to look too closely. And while the nation argued, while systems resisted accountability, one reality refused to move. 4 people were still dead. And no explanation, no report, no verdict would ever give their families what they wanted most. Time. As Part 3 came to a close, the story stood at a dangerous crossroads. If the truth was fully acknowledged, it would force change that cost money, convenience, and political capital. If it wasn't, the road would stay the same. And somewhere, another driver would grip a steering wheel, fighting symptoms they didn't understand, hoping they could make it just a little farther. The system had one chance to learn. Whether it would take it remained uncertain. The pressure became impossible to ignore. It started with a single decision that rippled outward, touching every corner of the case. The judge ordered a consolidated review, bringing together federal investigators, medical experts, labor regulators, and prosecutors in one coordinated timeline. What had been a fragmented inquiry was now a reckoning. For the first time, the system was being asked to look at itself. Miguel Alvarez was transferred from county custody to a federal holding facility pending the outcome. The move was procedural, but symbolically, it mattered. This was no longer a local case. It belonged to the country now. Behind closed doors, the NTSB finalized its interim findings. The language was careful, measured, almost painfully restrained, but the message underneath was sharp. Current commercial driver health evaluations were not designed to detect stress-induced neurological impairment. Reporting mechanisms discouraged disclosure. Economic pressure rewarded risk. In other words, the road was built to fail quietly. When excerpts of the report reached the press, the reaction was immediate. Some networks framed it as proof of systemic neglect. Others treated it as an excuse being manufactured after the fact. The split hardened, but something new crept in beneath the noise. Doubt. The kind that makes certainty uncomfortable. The families of the victims were invited to a private briefing. No cameras. No microphones. Just facts, delivered slowly, with room for questions that had no good answers. Some family members cried. Others sat still, absorbing details they never wanted to know. One father asked the question no one could avoid anymore. If this wasn't just him, he said, voice steady despite everything, then why did it have to be our kids? No one replied right away. Because there is no answer that fits inside justice. Miguel's defense team filed a motion to suppress language framing the crash as intentional or reckless pending final medical conclusions. Prosecutors pushed back, arguing that accountability didn't disappear just because cause was complex. The judge listened, and then did something unexpected. He delayed the charging decision. The courtroom froze when he spoke. Not dismissed. Not approved. Delayed. I will not rush a decision that carries consequences beyond this case, he said. The court requires clarity, not pressure. It was a rare moment of restraint in a system built for momentum. Outside, the delay was interpreted 1,000 different ways. To some, it was justice stalling. To others, justice finally breathing. Behind the scenes, regulators began moving faster than they ever had publicly. Emergency meetings, policy drafts, internal arguments that had been avoided for years resurfaced with urgency. One question dominated them all. How many warnings had been ignored because no one was required to hear them? Miguel underwent additional testing. Under controlled conditions, doctors replicated the stressors of long-haul driving. Hours of monotony, cognitive overload, physical fatigue. During one session, Miguel's responsiveness dropped suddenly, not to zero, but enough to matter. Enough to explain drift. Enough to terrify the room. This is not willful drive, Porter said afterward, but it is predictable. Predictable meant preventable, and preventable meant shared responsibility. The trucking company's attorneys reviewed the data with growing unease. Compliance had protected them before. Now it felt thin, vulnerable, like a shield made of paper. They issued a second statement, this one hinting at support for updated safety standards. It was cautious, calculated, but it marked a shift. Public conversation followed. For the first time, major outlets asked whether the nation's supply chain was built on invisible risk. Whether cheaper freight came at the cost of human fragility. Whether safety had been defined too narrowly for too long. Miguel, meanwhile, waited. He wrote letters that he wasn't sure would ever be sent. He apologized without excuses. He described the morning as best he could, even when words failed. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He said he didn't deserve it. He asked only that what happened to him not happen again. As the interim report became final, the NTSB issued a recommendation that sent shockwaves through the industry. Mandatory enhanced neurological screening for commercial drivers. Protected reporting for symptoms without immediate job loss. Revised scheduling standards recognizing cognitive fatigue, not just hours logged. Recommendations weren't laws, but they were warnings. The judge scheduled a final hearing. By then, the case was no longer just Miguel versus the state. It was an entire framework on trial. One that had traded precision for efficiency and hoped no one would notice the cracks. As Part 4 closed, the road ahead was visible for the first time. Not easy, not clean, but real. The question now was whether the system would accept responsibility alongside Miguel. Or whether it would find a way to let one man carry the weight alone. The final hearing did not feel like a courtroom drama. There were no raised voices, no grand speeches meant for television. What filled the room instead was gravity, the kind that settles when everyone understands there is no version of this story where everyone walks away whole. Miguel Alvarez sat at the defense table in a plain suit that didn't quite fit right. He looked smaller than he had in photographs, worn down by weeks of scrutiny, tests, and the knowledge that 4 families were measuring his future against their loss. The judge entered. The room rose, then settled. Prosecutors spoke first. They acknowledged the findings. They acknowledged the medical evaluations. But they returned, again and again, to the same truth. 4 people were dead. They argued that responsibility did not vanish just because intent was absent. That society relied on drivers to recognize when they were unfit to operate vehicles capable of causing catastrophic harm. That mitigation did not equal absolution. It was a careful argument. And it landed. Then Sarah Kim stood. She did not dispute the deaths. She did not minimize the pain. She spoke about standards and systems, about how responsibility had been distributed in theory but concentrated in practice. My client did not ignore warnings, she said. He lived inside them. She described a man who reported symptoms into a void. A man who passed the only tests he was given because the tests were not designed to catch what mattered. A man whose labor kept shelves stocked while his health quietly eroded. She paused. If this court declares that legal compliance is irrelevant, she said, then we must also declare that the institutions which certified, scheduled, and supervised him share that responsibility. The room remained silent. The judge asked questions. Direct ones. About oversight. About enforcement. About why recommendations had not become requirements long ago. No one had satisfying answers. Then came the moment no one expected. The judge invited the families to speak. Not all of them did. Some chose not to. One mother stepped forward, hands trembling but voice steady. She spoke about her son's laugh, about ordinary mornings, about the cruelty of randomness. She did not shout. She did not accuse. She said, "I don't want another family here." Her words changed the temperature of the room. When Miguel was allowed to speak, he stood slowly. His voice cracked only once. "I wake up every day wishing it had been me," he said. "I would trade places without hesitation. I don't ask for mercy. I ask for meaning." The judge recessed briefly. When he returned, his decision reflected the impossible balance before him. Miguel was held criminally responsible, but not to the maximum extent prosecutors had sought. The court recognized the role of systemic failure. Sentencing would include incarceration, but reduced, alongside mandatory medical treatment and a prohibition on commercial driving. The decision satisfied no one completely. And that was its honesty. But the ruling did something else. In its written opinion, the court issued a formal rebuke. Not just to Miguel, but to regulatory bodies, certifying agencies, and employers who hid behind minimum standards while ignoring human limits. It was rare, and it mattered. Within days, federal agencies announced accelerated rulemaking, enhanced medical screenings, confidential symptom reporting, revised fatigue models. What had been recommendations began transforming into requirements. The trucking industry reacted predictably at first. Concern, cost projections, warnings of disruption. Then reality set in. Public trust had shifted. The tolerance for invisible risk had thinned. Miguel was transferred to a medical facility within the correctional system. His letters to the families were finally delivered, accompanied by an option to read or not read, respond or not respond. Some families never opened them. One did. She didn't forgive him. She wrote back anyway. That letter would stay with Miguel longer than any sentence. As the months passed, the story faded from the front pages. New controversies replaced it. But in training centers, in regulatory offices, and in medical screening rooms, the changes quietly took root. Drivers began reporting symptoms without immediate punishment. Evaluations caught conditions that once slipped through. Schedules adjusted, sometimes reluctantly, but undeniably. The road did not become perfectly safe. But it became more honest. As Part 5 ended, the crash was no longer just a moment frozen in footage. It had become a line in history. A point where loss forced reflection. And where responsibility, for once, did not stop with the person easiest to blame. Time did what the court never could. It separated noise from consequence. Months passed, then a year. The crash in Indiana faded into the background of national memory, resurfacing only in policy briefings, training manuals, and the quiet thoughts of people who had lived inside it. But for those closest to the story, the impact never truly receded. Miguel Alvarez adapted to a life defined by limits. The medical facility was structured, quiet, almost gentle compared to the chaos that had consumed him before. Doctors monitored his condition closely. Under treatment, the episodes never returned. That fact haunted him more than if they had. Because it meant that what happened on that highway had been preventable. He attended counseling sessions where he spoke about guilt without being interrupted, without being corrected. He learned language for what his mind had done when his body refused to stop working. He learned that understanding was not forgiveness, but it was something. Outside, the industry changed in ways few people noticed but many felt. Medical screenings became deeper, slower, and more expensive. Neurological evaluations were no longer optional add-ons. Drivers began talking to each other about symptoms they once hid. Some left the road voluntarily. Others were pulled off it temporarily and returned safer. There was resistance, of course. Lawsuits, lobbying, arguments about overreach. But every objection ran into the same wall. 4 funerals. That memory became immovable. Regulators tracked the data closely. Near-miss incidents dropped. Unexplained lane departures decreased. Not vanished, but reduced enough to be undeniable. The system, imperfect as it remained, had absorbed the lesson. Miguel followed these changes from a distance, reading summaries Sarah Kim sent him, updates written carefully, never triumphantly. She reminded him that improvement did not erase harm. He never forgot that. One afternoon, Miguel received another letter. This one was different. It came from the sister of one of the victims. She wrote about anger that had nowhere to go, about nights spent imagining the crash from angles she would never truly see. She wrote that she did not forgive him. She did not excuse him. But she believed the changes mattered. That letter broke something open in Miguel that no therapy session ever had. He cried without shame. The judge who had presided over the case retired quietly 2 years later. In an interview near the end of his career, he spoke once about the case, carefully, without names. The law often asks us to choose between fairness and truth, he said. Sometimes the best we can do is refuse to pretend they are the same thing. The families moved forward in uneven ways. Some turned grief into advocacy. Others turned inward. All of them carried the weight differently, but none of them carried it alone anymore. The crash became part of training scenarios for emergency responders, investigators, and drivers alike. Not sensationalized. Studied. A case of cascading failure, human and institutional. And then came the final step. After serving his sentence and completing treatment, Miguel was released under supervision. He did not return to trucking. He did not want to. He found work that kept him grounded, present, with margins for rest and care. On the anniversary of the crash, Miguel visited a roadside memorial. He stood at a distance. He did not touch anything. He read the names. He whispered them, once. There were no cameras. No closure. Just acknowledgement. As Part 6 closed, the story approached its final truth. The crash had not been an anomaly. It had been a warning. And warnings only matter if they are heard. The road had listened. Now, only one question remained. What does accountability look like when no outcome can make things right? The answer waited in the final part. The truth arrived quietly, the way it always does when there is nothing left to argue. Years after the crash, long after the headlines had moved on and the footage stopped circulating, the Indiana highway looked ordinary again. Cars passed without noticing the stretch of road where 4 lives had ended and countless others had nearly followed. Asphalt does not remember. People do. Accountability, it turned out, did not come as a single verdict or reform. It came in fragments, spread across time, absorbed unevenly by those willing to carry it. Miguel Alvarez never drove a commercial vehicle again. That chapter of his life closed completely, not by force, but by choice. He understood now that responsibility was not only about following rules. It was about recognizing limits, especially when the cost of ignoring them could not be undone. He lived quietly. He worked steadily. He kept medical appointments the way he once kept delivery schedules, with seriousness and respect. The episodes never returned, not because they had vanished on their own, but because he was no longer living inside the conditions that had created them. He spoke once at a closed safety conference, not to the public, not to the media, but to regulators and trainers. He did not tell his story for sympathy. He told it because numbers alone did not change behavior. He said, I thought surviving meant pushing through. I didn't know stopping was part of safety. The room stayed silent long after he finished. The families carried on, each in their own direction. Some found purpose in advocacy. Others chose distance from everything connected to the crash. None of their paths were wrong. Grief does not follow policy. What united them, slowly and imperfectly, was the knowledge that what happened to their loved ones was no longer invisible. Their loss had reshaped something larger than a single case. Federal data, years later, confirmed what early reports had hinted at. Fatal crashes involving unexplained driver incapacitation declined. Reporting increased. Early intervention became normal rather than exceptional. The system did not become flawless, but it became more human. Regulations were no longer written only in response to disaster. They were written with anticipation. The trucking industry adapted, not because it wanted to, but because it had to. Safety became less about paperwork and more about people. Margins adjusted. Expectations shifted. The myth of the tireless driver finally began to fade. One regulator summarized it best in an internal memo that never went viral. We stopped pretending that compliance equals care. That sentence mattered more than any headline ever had. On the anniversary of the crash, a small group gathered near the memorial. No press. No speeches. Just presence. Some of the families stood together. Miguel stood far away, as he always did. No one approached him. No one asked him to leave. That distance was part of the truth too. The wind moved through the grass. Traffic passed. Life continued. Miguel left a folded note at the edge of the memorial, weighted with a stone. It did not contain apologies. Those had already been written. It contained a promise. That he would live carefully. That he would speak honestly. That he would never forget the cost of silence. As the years moved on, the story of the Indiana crash became something rare in public memory. Not a symbol to fight over. Not a cautionary tale stripped of complexity. but a case study in shared responsibility. It taught that harm can occur without malice. That legality is not morality. That systems fail quietly until they fail loudly. And that accountability is not about choosing one person to blame, but about refusing to let anyone hide. In the end, there was no redemption arc neat enough for television. There was only change. And change, imperfect and overdue, was the closest thing to justice that story could offer. The road did not forgive. But it did remember. And because it remembered, fewer people would be lost to the same silence again. That was the ending. Not a happy one, but a necessary one. The story was complete.